50,000 American troops don't move quietly, but somehow nobody's talking about why they moved. There's a number the Pentagon hasn't disclosed publicly: 14 nautical miles. That's the minimum choke point width at the Strait of Hormuz, and right now Iran doesn't need a navy to own it. Here's the board. 21% of the world's traded oil flows through that strait every single day, roughly 17 million barrels. If that channel closes, not explodes, not burns, just closes, the global economy doesn't slow down. It seizes. Within 72 hours, fuel prices spike across Asia. Within a week, European reserve. Calculations break. Within a month, the political map of the Middle East looks nothing like it does today. Washington knows this. Tehran knows Washington knows this. So why, in the last 2 weeks, has Iran been deliberately calm? To understand the move Iran just made, you have to forget everything you've read about Iranian naval power, because the conventional framing is almost completely wrong. Yes, the U.S. Navy dwarfs Iran's surface fleet. No argument there. America has 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Iran has none. The tonnage comparison is almost insulting. U.S. naval displacement runs into the millions. Iran's entire conventional fleet wouldn't fill a mid-sized harbor. That framing is exactly what Tehran wants you to use. Because Iran was never planning to fight the U.S. Navy, they were planning to make the U.S. Navy irrelevant. Here's how: over the last 6 years, quietly, methodically, without a single headline in Western defense press, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGC, has been constructing what analysts now call an asymmetric access denial envelope. Translate that out of Pentagon speak and it means this: a web of fast attack. Craft, shore-based anti-ship missiles, underwater drone systems, and this is the part that matters: dispersed launch infrastructure buried into the Zagros mountain foothills on the eastern Gulf Coast. The U.S. can destroy a naval base. It cannot simultaneously destroy 400 separate hardened launch cells spread across 600 kilometers of coastline. And 3 weeks ago, satellite imagery from 2 independent defense monitoring organizations, including one whose data the U.S. Air Force itself licenses, detected activation signals from no fewer than 23 of those cells simultaneously. That's not a drill. Now, the 50,000 troops CENTCOM's repositioning order, which leaked through 3 separate European defense publications before the Pentagon acknowledged any movement at all, involved pulling assets from 2 bases in Qatar, rotating a Marine Expeditionary Unit from Bahrain, and accelerating the forward deployment of an Army Striker Brigade that was originally scheduled for a Central Asian exercise rotation. That is not a defensive shuffle, that is a pre-positioning calculation. Here's what makes this different from every prior Gulf escalation cycle since 2019. In 2019, when tankers were mined in the Gulf of Oman, the response was loud: press conferences, attributed blame, sanctions announcements. This time, silence, complete silence. No U.S. official has publicly named Iran in connection with the repositioning. No State Department statement. No UK Foreign Office coordinated response. Even Israel, which comments on Iranian military activity the way most nations comment on weather, has said nothing for 11 days. That silence is louder than anything else on this board. Let's talk about the player no one's naming out loud, because the repositioning didn't start with Iran. It started with a message delivered through an intermediary in Muscat, Oman, sometime in the 3rd week of last month. The Omanis have played this role before, in 2013. They were the back channel through which early GPOA negotiations were seeded, quietly, deniably. This time, the message reportedly contained 3 components. 2 of them have since leaked in partial form to Reuters and to the Financial Times, though neither publication connected them. The 3rd component has not surfaced anywhere. What the 2 leaked components describe is this: Iran told Oman to tell Washington that any military action against Iranian nuclear enrichment infrastructure would trigger an immediate, non-negotiable closure of Hormuz, not via naval blockade, which can be challenged, but via the activation of that missile network, the 23 cell. Activation was the proof of concept, a demonstration, not an accident. Washington got the message, which is why 50,000 troops moved. Now here's where the analysis gets interesting, because a lesser power sending that kind of message usually ends one of 2 ways: either they blink under pressure, or they escalate into a confrontation they can't sustain. Iran appears to be doing neither. Instead, Tehran is doing something far more sophisticated: they're managing the clock. Here's the number that explains everything: 60%. That's roughly the uranium enrichment level Iran has reached at the Fordo facility, buried 80 meters underground in a mountain near Qom. Weapons grade is 90%, the gap between 60 and 90 is technically small weeks, not months, for a nation that has already solved the harder enrichment problems. Iran doesn't need to have a nuclear weapon to change the strategic equation. They need to be close enough that a military strike becomes too costly to contemplate, and they are now close enough. So why did the carriers go dark? 3 carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS Harry S. Truman, and a third whose name hasn't been confirmed in open source reporting, dropped off standard maritime tracking databases within a 48-hour window. AIS transponders, which commercial vessels are legally required to broadcast, are optional for warships. When a strike group goes dark simultaneously, it means one of two things. Either they're repositioning somewhere sensitive and don't want Tehran to calculate their exact vector, or they want Tehran to think that. Deliberate ambiguity is one of the oldest tools in naval deterrence. If Iran can't locate the carriers precisely, it cannot pre-program targeting solutions for its anti-ship missile systems. The Noor missile, Iran's domestically produced anti-ship weapon, derived from the Chinese C-802 platform, with a range of approximately 170 kilometers, requires precise targeting coordinates. No coordinates, no reliable strike. Going dark is a defensive move, and defensive moves, made by the world's most powerful navy, tell you something about how seriously Washington is taking that 23-cell activation. Here's the third layer, the one almost no outlet has connected yet. That third component of the Oman message, the one that hasn't leaked. There are exactly 2 plausible interpretations based on what has surfaced and what the troop movement pattern implies. The first, Iran demanded a specific, verifiable pause in U.S. military cooperation with Israel's Air Force over Iranian airspace corridors, not a public demand, a private one, the kind that can be quietly honored without either side losing face. The second interpretation is darker, and it's the one the true prepositioning geometry actually supports when you plot the unit locations against Iranian ballistic missile range arcs. The units aren't positioned to enter a conflict with Iran, they're positioned to survive the opening hours of one. Read that again. CENTCOM didn't move 50,000 troops forward, they moved 50,000 troops to hardened, dispersed positions outside the primary Iranian strike envelope for conventional ballistic missiles. The Qatari base Al Udeid, which sits within comfortable range of Iranian Shahab-3 missiles, saw a reduction in personnel. Assets moved away from the most exposed positions. That is not an offensive pre-positioning, that is damage mitigation, which means somewhere in the intelligence picture, someone handed a senior CENTCOM planner an assessment that said, there is a non-trivial probability that Iran fires first. So here is the full picture, the one that connects every piece. Iran has spent 6 years building a strike capability that cannot be neutralized in a single U.S. air campaign. They have reached an enrichment level that compresses the decision window for any military option 2 weeks. They demonstrated that capability through a live activation, communicated it privately through Oman, and then went quiet, giving Washington a choice. Strike now, at enormous cost, against a target that can close the artery of the global oil economy and hit every U.S. base in the Gulf within 45 minutes of an opening salvo, or don't. Washington blinked, not publicly, not in a way that looks like retreat. The troops moved forward, the messaging stayed hard, the press releases were firm. But the geometry of where those troops went and where they didn't tells the operational truth. The U.S. is not preparing to strike Iran right now. It is preparing to absorb an Iranian response to something that hasn't happened yet. And the thing that hasn't happened yet, the decision sitting right now in a room in Washington that no elected official wants to publicly own, that's the question nobody's asking. Because if Iran crosses 90% enrichment in the next 6 weeks, that calculation changes entirely. Every timeline, every troop position, every silent carrier in the Gulf, it all gets recalculated from zero. There is one country watching that enrichment clock more closely than Washington, and it hasn't been quiet for 11 days because it agrees with U.S. restraint. That story and what it means for the next move on this board is where this goes next.